Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another installment of the Spring Seminar Series presentation. It's hosted by the SNF Center for Atlantic Studies at Simon Fraser University. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today as we depart from our traditional lecture style format to introduce a roundtable event on ancient past for modern audiences, a critical approach to pedagogy and the digital humanities in ancient Mediterranean studies. My name is Sabrina Higgins, and I'm an assistant professor in the departments of global humanities and archaeology here at SFU. And I'm thrilled today to be joined by some of my closest colleagues, friends, collaborators, grad student, my husband, as we offer you a preview of the chapters from our upcoming edited volume to which we all contributed, Ancient Past for Modern Audiences, Public Scholarship in the Mediterranean World. So I'll introduce our speakers today. First, we will hear from Dr. Christine Johnston. Can I say the new title? Is it official?
Well, it doesn't start till September.
Well,
Still assistant
professor, soon to be associate professor at Western Washington University. Megan Daniels, assistant professor, Department of Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies at UBC. Gino Canlas, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher for the Database of Religious History at UBC. Also, I am allowed to say it, Gino, the newly appointed faculty member, though not necessarily officially yet, at Western University in London. Congratulations, Gino. My PhD student, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Archaeology, Aurora Camaño. And my husband, who also happens to be a lecturer at Capilano University, Mike Lawrence.
It's an inside job.
It is an inside job. So over the course of the next hour or so, an author from each of the chapters will give a short overview of the contributions to the volume, situating their work within the broader discussion of responsible public scholarship that forms the basic premise of our edited volume. This is going to be followed by an informal discussion amongst the panel members, which interrogates the contents of our chapters, the way in which we conceive of ourselves as public scholars, and the necessary responsibility to constantly re-examine, reflect on, and critique our own projects and positionality within the discipline. As each of us approach public scholarship from different perspectives and varying levels of direct participation, we hope to use the space to foster conversation around the role of digital humanities and pedagogy in the responsible translation of knowledge to our diverging audiences. To do so, however, we must interrogate the notion of a public, the relationship of our projects to neoliberal institutions, and address the ways in which our scholarship and pedagogy must engage with the living humanities of the people that we study. As public scholars, it's also imperative that we reflect on our commitments to social justice, which is especially pertinent to those of us in the field of classics and its related disciplines, as it remains deeply entangled with racist and exclusionary agendas, which have impacted how scholars communicate knowledge on this past. We must also grapple with whether these commitments to social justice within our field also extend to modern conflicts. Do those of us working in the MENA region, for instance, where ongoing conflicts such as those in Palestine, Yemen, Sudan, and Syria, among others, have had catastrophic impacts on human life and cultural heritage, have a responsibility to engage with these issues directly in our public scholarship? We hope to use today's roundtable to address some of these issues, it's a lot to unpack, and to use our chapters as a springboard to facilitate a broader discussion around critical digital humanities and pedagogy and responsible public scholarship. Now, with this in mind, I will turn our panel over to our first speaker, Christine Johnston, who will provide us with a glimpse into her chapter entitled Teaching the Ancient World with Reproductions, and she brought some, using printed 3D objects in authentic active history learning.
So I suppose we wait and pass these out later, so it's not, okay. Can we take a moment and appreciate if this is Wayne Gretzky? We're doing introduction. This is the most Canadian setting ever. We want to talk about idolatry and ideology.
Let's start there.
Well, I can get us started while we kind of figure out the technology. So the Ancient World in 3D project is a project that I started with three grad students or MA students at Western Washington University. We were talking about grad school applications, and it was sort of a different conversation. And then we were talking about some of the new and really exciting ways that museums in particular were using 3D prints to create accessible experiences for, oh, yay. Okay.
The mouse just has to be in it. It's in Zoom.
For visitors and patrons with visual impairments. Yay, okay. So we started this project and we were conceiving of a sort of approach to pedagogy in which we wanted to explore whether or not 3D prints and replicas were going to improve both or enhance student learning. And this was by creating these multimodal and authentic active learning experiences. And I'm going to define what I mean by those terms, as well as to increase accessibility, both in terms of the sort of exclusionary nature of a lot of cultural heritage held in elite overseas museums, as well as, of course, different learning styles and different learning needs. So that was the sort of goal behind this. Okay. And this focuses on a constructivist learning paradigm. So this is the sort of dominant learning paradigm that exists within social sciences. And the idea is that knowledge is not transmitted in a sort of passive banking deposit structure, like the famous Freire articulation, but that it's attained through both active and sort of mentally engaged experiences that allow you to participate in an activity and to really think metacognitively about the learning process. Yes, okay. So to define some of these terms that I'm working with here, we're focused on, again, the sort of idea of active learning, of mental and physical engagement in the activity and the cognitive awareness of what is being done. I also really wanted to incorporate a lot of group work. There's been a ton of research in the learning sciences that says group work and pure learning, especially in problem solving, really elevate the deep learning process or significant learning. I also wanted to incorporate what we would refer to as authentic learning. And that means that you are engaging in the type of activity as a student that you would as a professional in the field. So as a numismatist, we would study coins. And so I wanted them to have the opportunity to handle coins. So that sort of authentic action as a learner. And that helps to induct students into what we refer to as communities of practice. And so this idea sort of centers the both methods and the epistemologies, the way we construct knowledge, in order to become a sort of member of, in this case, a history or archaeology discipline in which you are thinking through and acting as a sort of member of that community. So those are some of the sort of pedagogical frameworks that guided this project and the development of this project. So as part of this, we first developed 2 learning modules that I'll introduce you to here. We then conducted in-class testing over 5 different courses between winter 2020 and spring 2023. And so we're writing up the results of that. That was primarily qualitative in terms of having students survey responses to their experiences. And then this chapter really focuses on the 3rd learning module that we've since developed. So just to give you a very brief introduction to the first 2, the first focuses on texts and writing in antiquity. So it introduces students to the act of writing, the sort of style of writing that we see, different scripts, how we approach translation and transliteration of ancient texts. And then students have the opportunity, in addition to looking at a variety of prints of 3D seals, as well as our mathematical tablet here. Anybody happen to know what it shows? I always hand this out and rarely do students get it. And yet every single one of you have seen this in your life. Do you know?
No.
Is it trigonometry?
It's the Pythagorean theorem,
Oh.
named, of course, for Greek Pythagoras, but existing here 1,300 years earlier on a Babylonian seal, so or a tablet. So a great opportunity as well to interrogate those sort of narratives of science beginning in the Western world and with the Greek sort of praxis. And then students have the opportunity to create their own rebus principle, create their own phrases, and then try and decipher each other's phrases, which is always a very entertaining experience. The second focused on numismatics. I come from a background in economics, so I work on economic history and environmental history. So for me, this is always a really enjoyable one. We talk about the development of both exchange economies and then currency, its role in exchange, as well as its role, of course, in propaganda and ideology. And so they have an opportunity to look at prints of 4 different coins. I brought some today, so you can take a look at those as well. And to discuss not only the sort of learning and experience of trying to decipher them, but then also try and sort of connect this to different ideologies and texts that we've read in class. So those were the first two that were developed. We then tested those in class. The third that was developed that is the sort of focus of this chapter is centered on cultural heritage, on questions of looting, restitution, and the role of digital replicas or reproductions in some of these conversations. And I really, I think, appreciated the way that this module in particular centers the sort of object-based learning component here that is focused on the digital technologies. Because a big part of these conversations of restitution are things like scanning, both as a mechanism for creating sort of digital versions that can be shared, but I think most problematically as an alternative to restitution, to repatriation. And so I think it allows us to really center these conversations of repatriation and how technology is in some ways sort of allowing us to skirt these important obligations, these ethical obligations. I also chose for this, this is one of the rare examples where we have maybe more famous pieces with the Nefertiti bust. So with the objects incorporated in these modules, I really tried to center lived experience in antiquity and the sort of objects of day-to-day life. So we have some Cycladic figurines as well as a heart scarab from ancient Egypt. And each of these allows us to focus on a specific conversation. So the Cycladic figurines, for those of you who aren't just familiar, were heavily forged and distributed through the art market for quite a long time. So it allows us to talk about the sort of history of forgery, of looting, and of antiquities trade. The heart scarab, because of its role in burial within ancient Egypt, allows us to really focus in on the ethics of both excavation of burial contexts, mortuary contexts, as well as, of course, the really problematic component of ancestral remains being dispersed throughout different landscapes. And then, of course, in its worst version, horrible things like 3D printing a voice box and then trying to claim that an ancestral human being is speaking to us, for those of you familiar with the story. And then the bust of Nefertiti, which is our sort of really famous example, and it's had some really cool sort of history recently where there was the reproduction that was created and then disseminated without permission by the museum. So it allows us to focus in on these different kind of conversations. And then all of our, oh no, wrong one, this way. Oh no, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I did. The end. Okay. And then all of these teaching modules developed through this are shared open access through our website that we've developed. That includes links to both the models, the 3D models and scans that we're using, instructions on how to print materials. The modules also include alternatives if you aren't, of course, having access to a 3D printer or can't make your own replicas. So we talk through alternatives. And then all of the worksheets and the students' activities are also shared there. So the idea was to create these modules that were useful in our teaching and then make them shareable and accessible to any kind of teacher in any time and place. Okay, the end. And hopefully you're the next slide. Yes, okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So our people in the past who are rest of me and my two friends and colleagues on either side of me, along with 4 others who are not here today. We've definitely roped these other 2 into producing content for us too, so they're also part of it. I will just give a brief overview of what People in the Past is, although I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And of course, we applied for this grant to fund this conference that we held pretty much a year ago, almost to the day, downtown SFU. And this was our contribution to this edited volume that's now coming out, People in the Past, Multivocality and Multimodality in Ancient Mediterranean Studies and Teaching. Wait, I'm also going to my computer. So this is a multimedia digital humanities initiative that produces and hosts free open access resources for teaching and learning about, and I underline this, both real people in the ancient world and also the real people in the modern world who study them, giving voice to both the past and present. And I mean, our overarching goals with this project from its start in the summer of 2020 are to produce content about the past beyond the so-called big history and beyond the dominant historical perspectives that we are often fed as students and read in textbooks and see on the Discovery Channel and so on and so forth. And also to challenge the narrow stereotypes of who gets to tell history and whose stories historians choose to tell. So a lot of what I'll talk about in this brief presentation is kind of actually, I'm glad actually Christy went first because she better explained a lot of these pedagogical theories, but they do involve centering multivocal voices and bringing people, learners, interested parties, students into the conversation of creating and understanding and being a part of creating these narratives of the past as well. And so a lot of that ties into what Christy described as communities of practice and constructivist learning. So I'll just name start with two quotes that we start off our chapter with. One by David Wengrow: "The study of ancient history is institutional and exclusionary, still the stuff of galleries, museums, and UNESCO World Heritage Sites, of prized images, objects, structures, rather than of living humanity." And then another inspirational quote: "Although archaeologists may not be diverse, the past peoples we study are. Therefore, we must create our knowledge in diverse and multivocal communities in order to rigorously understand the human past." And so, but like Wengrow's quote really gets to that first problem, that the past is often told as this kind of big history homogenizing narrative that excludes, the everyday people, the bakers, the children, all sorts of people who I keep thinking of bakers. We have a wonderful podcast. Podcast on bakers in the room. I am hungry. And also, of course, the second quote gets at the fact that also our field has historically been not completely diverse as well. And so, as Sabrina mentioned in the introduction, that a lot of the scholarship on the Mediterranean world has kind of originated from, and also kind of remains centered on, or entangled with, I should say, racist and exclusionary agendas. And these often kind of masquerade even on the Discovery Channel or in textbooks, or even in peer-reviewed articles, as kind of detached and objective and sober accounts of the past, and without a lot of recognition of the racial hierarchies and perspectives within which it is embedded. And I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years or so, that there has been a lot of moves towards creating new initiatives that focus on multivocality, multilingualism, community engagement, outreach, and public scholarship to really make inroads towards becoming diverse and to divesting from these harmful legacies. And so our chapter is really to demonstrate Peopling the Past's contribution to these endeavors through the production of rich multimedia, multimodal, and multivocal teaching resources that in themselves, and both how they are incorporated into educational curricula, can help students to see beyond traditional narratives and meta-narratives, and also for themselves to be active narratives in learning about the past. And I'll quote one other scholar who's influential for our chapter, Priya Jackson. And with all our moves to diversify and divest from legacies of racial hierarchies, she writes that countering these problematic narratives can't be limited to what she calls moderate actions, such as, and I quote, "the passive resistance of just citing scholars of color or just electing chairs of color. These are never enough to uproot whiteness." And instead, scholars must explicitly challenge to quote her, "the lifetime of skewed representation that have been absorbed by students." And so much of this change has to happen on the educational level. All of us also grew up in those kind of educational systems that didn't necessarily acknowledge these problematic pasts of the discipline. So Christy kind of went through a lot of, oh my God, I keep doing this. So this is our so all of our media on Peopling the Past showcases the specialist guest. It's aimed at a general audience. So it's meant to kind of, as I said, focus on the real people who study the past, as well as the real people in the past. We aim at a general audience, and we make it available and accessible online. And it's multimedia. And this is something I'll get into in terms of how the pedagogical usage of Peopling the Past and how this can also be used to counter these narratives. But then these include, of course, podcast videos and blogs, all of which themselves are enriched with supplemental media. So, and in this chapter, we kind of delve into some of the similar concepts that Christy already did for the 3D object scanning chapter. We talk, our media promotes a constructivist approach, as well as the way it's integrated into courses. And as Christy was saying, the core premise is that in constructivism is that knowledge is actively constructed by the learners themselves. So Christy mentioned the banking model, where you kind of deposit knowledge onto passive recipients, and they just passively absorb it. This is something that, approach that's meant to make students active learners. And I'd say the actual content itself is kind of meant to, in and of itself, is meant to kind of achieve this type of approach. The podcasts, for example, are conversational. They're conversations between 2 or 3 people about research into the ancient world that are kind of meant to invite students into this approach as well. There's a lot of metacognition that also highlights the research process that goes into producing research on the ancient world, that once again is kind of built into the conversations that students would hear on podcasts, would witness in videos, would read about in the blogs. And what else? We focus on the ways in which these can be incorporated, focus on both cognitive and effective learning goals. This includes both, once again, exposing students to new knowledge, like the cognitive component, acquiring new types of knowledge about the ancient world that they normally wouldn't be exposed to. And the effective part is more kind of the emotional components. And I quote, I just like this quote also in our chapter by Leon Gardner, that involves teaching students to have respect for people different from oneself, to adopt principled ethical behavior, lifelong learning, and effective interpersonal interaction and teamwork. So a lot of our posts are, one of our blog series is called Unknown Peoples, and it's meant to shed light on peoples that are often misrepresented, marginalized, understudied in the ancient world. So once again, trying to bring that from the cognitive standpoint, just to bring new knowledge to students, but also to kind of engage them with what it's like to be. For example, one of our blogs is on the unknown lives of sailors in antiquity. So what is it actually like to experience that kind of lifestyle as a person in the past? And of course, we also, all of our content is very rich media format, and also kind of a lot, just like the constructivist approach is meant to kind of gather people into these communities of practice, groups of people who share concern or passion for something they do. So it's kind of expressing that by the guests that we invite on this, and also the ways in which we incorporate it into classroom learning. This is just a chart that kind of demonstrates the effectiveness of combining multiple sources together. And I think it's for me, in terms of revamping some of my courses, moving away from textbooks, trying to produce more free open access educational content. It's been really meaningful to kind of incorporate podcast videos, blogs, alongside getting students to learn from scholarly articles and monographs and things like that. So just a lot, and one of the top kind of positive comments I get on this is, of course, the ability to integrate so many different modes of learning. Once again, in terms of diversifying our field, really kind of it's one thing that's often also ignored, is the fact that, of course, our students themselves are diverse learners and require diverse modes of learning to absorb knowledge, to kind of engage with knowledge as well. And certainly listening to conversations, reading blogs, watching people speak on videos, it can be so much more engaging and can draw the student learner into this knowledge process so much more than simply reading articles and textbooks. Oh, this is Gino's. I think some of my stuff get cut off. I thought I had one more. I had something about the podcast assignments and how and how Sabrina and others had kind of I emphasized a lot of the formats of our resources as in and of themselves, kind of being very constructivist, being very rich media, and helping students, kind of inducting students into those communities of learning and knowledge production, not just consuming knowledge. But I was also going to give an example of also how then you can incorporate a lot of, our chapter goes into how we can use also those resources to incorporate into broader classroom assignments. And this one included listening to People in the Past podcasts, and getting students to produce further questions that they would ask these podcasts, that they would ask podcast guests on these topics, and even themselves to produce, to research, write, and produce their own podcast based on their topic, which once again is such a more engaging way and rewarding way to many students. And once again, a diverse community of learners in terms of engaging with this field. And I really try to stress to my students, even when we're doing things like traditional paper writings, that they themselves really see themselves as moving from just being consumers of knowledge to being active producers of knowledge, even just as a student in a university. And I think, bringing them face to face with many of our resources that showcase young learners themselves, early career scholars, I think has been really inspiring to them. So yeah, so our chapter kind of goes through more into each of the blog videos and podcasts do that. But yeah, that's kind of our chapter in a nutshell. I will pass it on to Gino.
Thank you. Thank you. What is that? Huh, I didn't know this was animated.
You run through.
Okay, so the chapter that I co-wrote with all of these different people who didn't bother to show up concerns the different methods with which the database of religious history is attempting to engage a global audience, and this is our landing page. So the database of religious history, last time I'm going to say that it's DRH, is an online open access digital repository of information on the global history of religion. It's a project based at UBC, directed by Professor Edward Slingerland of the philosophy department. And the project aims to study the history of religion from across the entire globe for the entirety of human experience. So that is from the beginning of human history until like 5 minutes ago. It's further envisioned as an active, up-to-date reference tool for scholars of religion. It's a classroom tool and also a host for specialized data sets. And so the DRH is likewise committed to adapting and responding to the needs of audiences as the project develops. So it's not a static thing. It's meant to change depending on what our users, what our tech guys, what our editors think that it should take. So what I'm going to be discussing today is how team members of the DRH address the role of open scholarship responsibly in the realm of open access, digitally native projects. And I'm also going to be discussing some of the ways that we've been succeeding in doing that, and also some of the ways in which we haven't really been succeeding. So this is what an entry in the DRH looks like. To briefly describe the DRH for this audience, the database is structured around individual answers to sets of questions called polls. In this way, it's different from a traditional encyclopedia or wiki that consists solely of written entries on a particular topic. We have 3 types of polls currently. The first type is the group entries, which encompasses any grouping of humans that has an identifiable shared practice or belief. This can be a denomination, it can be an ethnic group. The second type of poll that we have is a place entry, which focuses on any tangible structure related to an aspect of religion. This can include a shrine, a temple, churches, mosques, burials, etc. And then the third type that we have are the text entries, broadly that covers any scripture, hymn, mythology, dedicatory inscription, or any written material that might be relevant to the study of religion. These are not just what do you call them? Holy scriptures. These can be anything related to the study of religion. So each answer in a poll is assigned a date range and a geographical set of 1 or more polygons. So when you are creating an entry, you have to create a map of where that is so that it's geolocatable. And then you answer a set of questions that are generally binary in nature. So the only options for the answers are yes or no, or the field doesn't know, or you personally don't know. And the examples of the questions that you're going to be asked could be, are supernatural beings present in this religion? Is there monumental architecture in this religious place? Are there human sacrifices performed at this site, for example? And for each answer, you can also explain yourself a little bit more. For example, what if you're answering something a little bit controversial? Maybe some scholars don't think this. So we have ample features where you can comment and explain yourself, why you would answer the way. I think I hold the record for the longest comment of the DRH right now. Yeah. Once an entry has been published, researchers can read the poll individually, or they can use our browse and visualize tools to query entries, tags, comments, and regions to examine trends in any aspect of religion stored in the database. And these tools are all open access. You don't need to create an account to use it. You don't need to sign up. And if you ask certain questions in our browse and visualize tool, for example, what did I ask in this one? Is monumental religious architecture present? You can create an animation. This one is not animated, unfortunately, because I just screenshotted it. And you can turn it into a heat map. It can be a polygon or it can be a heat map. And you can start from the beginning of our coverage to the present. And basically you can see how it changes in different regions over time. And it's actually pretty cool. But so who do we get to fill in these entries? So each entry is filled in by people we call experts, and these are usually academics who research some aspect of religion, even if religion is not their main specialization. As a general rule, we recruit PhDs on people who are so grad students who are doing their PhDs onwards, but we can be fairly lax about who we recruit when it comes to credentials. If they're an MA student, for example, who has done excellent research at a particular site, and they were recommended to us by their supervisor that their research should actually be on the website, then we ask them to contribute it. They are all assigned editors who guide them through the process of creating and publishing an entry. We currently have a team of 35 editors. Last time I counted, I might be wrong because I did count it by hand. And after publication, each entry gets a DOI, so it actually counts as an actual publication. And we're currently offering our experts an honorarium per entry, which at the moment is $300 Canadian per entry. The only times we don't give honoraria for completed entries is if these entries were being written by students for a course for which they were being marked. In that case, that wouldn't really be appropriate. So early on, we envisioned that the DRH would engage with scholarship from outside Anglophone academia because there's a significant amount of scholarly traditions from outside of North America and Western Europe that often gets ignored in the West. And if we're serious about diversifying our fields, we can't ignore a large part of the world. We haven't been successful with this. We currently have 585 experts as of 30 minutes ago. Only about 1/4 of those are from outside the US, Canada, and Western Europe at this point. And that 1/4 mostly came from the last 3 years. So it's actually good, it's growing. And because of this, questions surrounding language and translation are crucial to the DRH. We intended for the DRH to have a multilingual interface, and it's currently fully available in English, French, and Mandarin Chinese. And it's almost available in Spanish, Arabic, and Japanese after we finish fighting with our translators. We also allow our experts to write the written portions of their entries in any language that they are most comfortable in, even if that's not a language that our interface currently has. If you can't turn the database into, for example, Portuguese right now, you can still write your comments, your descriptions in Portuguese. You can write your title in any language. What we struggle with is the fact that our database is constantly developing. So our English language interface is the default, and that develops rapidly. So we have weekly meetings. Suddenly we decide, okay, this is actually not a very good question, so we should change it. And suddenly we have a lot of catch up to do with the other languages as well. So it's kind of, the more rapidly that we are developing the website, the more that we lag behind in our multilingual interface. So questions surrounding language and translation are crucial to the DRH. We intended for the DRH to have a multilingual interface, but like I said, we're struggling a little bit with that. One other challenge is that to be able to recruit experts from all around the world, we have to be financially accessible. A lot of academics are often precariously employed. Early career academics, for example, often struggle with participating in activities outside their main teaching or research because they are often overworked and underpaid, and sometimes not paid at all. So we're committed to paying our experts for the work they contribute for as long as we have funding. And in this way, we're able to provide a platform for scholars who are not as established. But of course, that's not really enough. We're still dealing with systems that are inherently unfair. So we're kind of just throwing a little bit of money at the problem. As much as possible, the editors try to recruit local scholars from the regions we work in. I work in Greece predominantly, and so I generally try to get scholars from working in Greece to participate. And our recruitment process is largely informal. We search for scholars on department websites, ResearchGate, Academia, on X, formerly Twitter. Often they're grad students that their supervisors recommended to us. And so what we do when we identify someone who might be interested in contributing an entry, we email them an invitation, ask them to sign up. What tends to happen though is that editors naturally have the tendency to be more successful in recruiting from their own professional networks despite casting a wide net, which is understandable, but also something that we still do need to work on. So to conclude, by opening up the project's recruitment method of data collection and interface, the DRH hopes to foster an open platform where scholars from across the globe can contribute to and use a constantly growing collection of data about religious history. We still have a lot of work to do in order to be fully global, but these are some of the things that we've so far been attempting. And yeah, that's Sabrina.
So our chapter in this volume introduces the Digital Mary Project, and this is a collaborative venture between Simon Fraser University as well as the National Hellenic Research Foundation. And it's also supported by the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab here at SFU. Our project directors are Sabrina, as well as Nikki Saranas, who's at the National Hellenic Research Foundation. So in our chapter, we cover both how this project was originally designed, how it currently operates, as well as some of the critical ways that we see this project needing to change to address some of the essentialism that's inherent in the current database structure of the project. So my role with the project is I've worked as a research assistant for the project for quite a few years. I've been heavily involved in the collection, the writing, and the preparation of the database entries. So this is the blurb. Oh, it's not connected to my computer.
There we go.
So this is the blurb that you are met with when you enter the site, but some of these aspects will be changing as our direction has begun to change. But the Digital Mary Project was designed to be a Mariological resource dedicated to the collection, the curation of material culture related to the Virgin Mary and her cult. The initial iteration of this project took what we are now calling a tools and archives approach. And the primary aim of that was the creation of a comprehensive and easily searchable open access database that was going to bring together the known artistic productions, artifacts, architectural features, and sites related to the cult of the Virgin Mary, thereby making this study, a study of this important and often hidden material easily accessible and centralized both for academics and the wider public. And these goals, accessibility and the consolidation of Mariological imagery remains one of the core objectives of the project. But after a period of reflection and reimagining, which we chronicle in our chapter, we were led to recognizing that while online databases have a critical role in digitally organizing, curating, storing, and facilitating data that can serve as a wellspring for humanistic insights and inquiry, they're not necessarily in and of themselves humanistic spaces. So if the Digital Mary Project wants to fully embody the spirit of a digital humanities, we require a significant redesign and shift in focus from being solely a digital tool for the humanities toward cultivating a more dialogic virtual home for the material study of Mary. And so this redesign is going to equally prioritize critical humanistic thought, reflexivity, inquiry, and meaningful engagement and collaboration among its users. So the archival component of the project currently has had very specific period and regional parameters. The database was focused on the late antique and early medieval Eastern Mediterranean, which is where the Marian tradition emerges, and therefore is cataloging the earliest depictions of Mary, covering the emergence and the formative development of her cult. And this is, of course, also the scholarly expertise of the current small Digital Mary team, which is why this has been our focus. We have around 300 entries to date, and our entries range from monumental wall paintings and buildings to fine portable artistic works like ivories and cameos, to the more everyday objects like lead seals, embroidered linen fragments, incised ceramics, reliquary crosses. And as we've begun to reflect on our project, we've recognized some of the limitations that are inherent in this narrow scope. And so a decision has been made to expand the project both geographically as well as temporally to better capture the globalness of the cult of the Virgin Mary, a cult which is still very much alive today. And this change means that we will have to relinquish a certain degree of control over the production of our archive and also broaden our community of contributors beyond our current academic networks and teams to both diversify the types of Mariological representations that are being included in the Digital Mary project, as well as to bring in fresh perspectives and areas of expertise. The first years of the project were spent closely working with the Digital Humanities Innovation Lab here at the Simon Fraser University Library to develop our custom digital home. And this has allowed us to have a lot more creative control and flexibility that we need to house this collection, as well as to make room for some of the other initiatives that we are going to be adding to transform the Digital Mary project from an archival tool to the digital counterspace envisioned in our chapter. We'll take a quick look at an entry. Again, I keep on forgetting, it's not connected to the computer. There we go. Take a quick look at what an entry looks like currently in our project. So you can see that each individual entry features an object description and a series of drop-down menus where users can locate credits and bibliographic information, inscriptions, translations of those inscriptions. And as you move further down, you can see a lot of other important descriptive information about either the object or the place, as well as images. So location, where these items are currently, where they were found, information about who appears in these images beyond just Mary, what Mariological scenes and other characters might you see in these images. So as we reflected while drafting our chapter on whether the digital humanities platform we were building captured the spirit of humanistic research, we identified 3 initial changes that we want to make to reinfuse a sense of critical humanistic narrative and community to the project. So the first is the addition of an interpretive field to each object entry, and this is going to allow for more reflexive narratives concerning the trajectories of use, production, collection history, and iconographic identification. The second is in order to counter the insular and sort of closed nature of the project in its current state, in terms of the collection process, as it's been really limited to us and our small team of research assistants. We want to build a community conversations page where discussions, objects for analysis, critical commentary can be initiated by anyone who has an interest in Mariology. And then finally, we also hope to add a blog or a features page to the project with the intent to feature researchers who are using critical theory to engage with Marian themes. And this is just a starting point. And in the name of time, I'll wrap it up there. So yeah, this design is still in its infancy, but we're really excited to hopefully have the Digital Mary project ready for everyone else to see soon. So yes, thank you to the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies, Digital Humanities Innovation Lab, and the National Hellenic Research Foundation in Athens.
Great, thanks. All right, so I'm gonna turn things over to Mike to kick off a bit of a conversation amongst all of us in the chapter.
Right. I'm going to reference the bakers.
Thank
Thank you everybody for the great talk, and it was super interesting for me, even as a political theorist. So I have 2 questions. Should I stick to 1 or 2?
Let's
And just
do
let
one.
That people sort of feel it out. The first question is a general question that, you know, people can speak to if they wish. With regards to each project or approach, there seems to be a reference to this notion of the critical present. So I want to ask, in what sense are we talking about critique or critical theory or the critical? If you could speak to that a little bit more. There was some speaking directly and indirectly to that. Is this a history from the bakers? Is that the bakers? Are we talking about, you know, critical theory in the sense of class analysis? I've heard some references to constructivism, to anti-essentialism as a kind of approach, but it seems we have a kind of a broad net of the notion of being critical. And I suppose this relates, I'm going to lodge another question in here for the digital Marius. What is the spirit of digital humanism as a Hegelian? What is the digital humanity?
That's a loaded question.
We need
Anyway.
10 minutes until
So the
Hegelian.
critical question.
Okay, so I'll kick us off because I think part of what our chapter was struggling with and what Aurora and I were really struggling with is not to throw it back on you, Mike, but we were struggling with you and your critique of our chapter, which was very rightly earned. And so to be very, very frank, when Aurora and I conceived of this talk originally, how I envisioned this was, you know, databases as democratizing spaces. And Mike laughed in my face.
Nope.
And we had a really great conversation about, you know, you can't talk about databases as, you know, these democratizing spaces because it's inherently embedded into, more broadly speaking, the neoliberal university and this idea of digital humanities as a way for scholars to publish and get credit for those publications and constantly feeding back into this neoliberal narrative. And upon further reflection, I think Aurora and I came to the very real understanding that what we were doing wasn't critical at all. There was no space within the database for us to have any critical reflexivity. I mean, we had a description page and we were describing the objects from our point of view. And so the first thing that we realized was we actually also have to have an interpretive section. If we're going to have a critical space, there needs to be a space within the database to allow for that critique, to engage with scholarship. And along the way, and even sort of post submission of our chapter to the reviewers, there's still so many more ways in which I think that we can engage in the critical sort of space. But I think first of all, it was recognizing that what we were doing, you know, sort of the two of us and our collaborator, Nikki in Athens, gatekeeping information was also extremely problematic. We have control over who gets invited, which research assistants we choose, and how do you allow for a broader conversation that has sort of a wide array of, you know, critical views to make its way in. And so I'm really cognizant of time, so I'm going to pass it on to somebody else, but we can come back to that.
I have thoughts.
Yes.
Yeah, always. So in terms of the two chapters I was a part of, the 3D printing and the peopling the past, they're really, I think, pedagogically driven by both Indigenous and Black feminist critiques. So authors like Bell Hooks, Sonia Adelaide, post-colonial critiques, Yang and Tuck, Max Laboran, following this sort of critique of Western dominant epistemologies, of how knowledge is constructed, the participatory process through that. So the focus on decentering canon, decentering particular narratives, the focus on effective learning in particular. So what Bell Hooks talks about as the love ethic, what Indigenous scholars like Keisha Supernant and Sonia Adelaide talk about as pedagogies of the heart. Similarly, you know, Ferrer has you know, and Bell Hooks have both written about these different sort of pedagogical approaches focused on the effective both positionality of yourself as a scholar that leans into the expertise of experience and the expertise of knowledge, and a focus on the humanity and the sort of humanistic connection to the material and to the past. So in terms of the sort of critical methodologies employed, those have sort of driven both the 3D printing project and then the pedagogical theory outlined in our chapter.
For me, I think in terms of critical, it's more just teaching, once again, students to be questioners through these resources. So all of the way I teach courses are often centered around 3 questions that I did not make up, that I read on Twitter, in Judy Cantor's Twitter, who she was also quoting someone else, but who writes the stories, who's benefits from the stories and who's missing from the stories. And so to me, those kind of questions really drive the students to kind of think about the problems with the narratives that we construct and that we as educators hand down to them. So I think it's providing space in all of our pedagogy for students to kind of ask those questions about the narratives that we're giving them, the ancient world, even the stuff that's being presented in people in the past. And yeah, so when I think of the critical or the critique, it's actually a lot of it has to do with pedagogy. Of course, it feeds back into our scholarship too, and that's a whole other level. But yeah, that's me thinking about the critical.
Thinking Mike, at least in the case of myself and my co-authors, most of whom are postdocs, I think our critique stems from dissatisfaction with because we probably use it more often than anyone else, since we're full-time employees of the project. We're more familiar with it than our bosses probably at this point. And there are aspects of it that really do frustrate us on a day-to-day basis. I didn't talk about it too much, but sort of similar to the things that the Digital Mary project was struggling with. When it comes to the qualitative, I think the postdocs would agree with me. This is not going online permanently, right?
It is.
I think some of the things we struggle with is we do have some qualitative aspects in the database where, we get to write comments and stuff like that, but that doesn't really get acknowledged in any of the major digital analyses that we got. So there's some dissatisfaction on our part in how the database works. I think for our critique, that's where it comes from.
There's a lovely reflexive moment in your presentation, though, Gino, that I kind of appreciated, where you talked a little bit about, after talking about the production of an open access type database, where you talked about the notion of how often this is built on precarious labor.
Mhm.
I kind of I thought that was a really nice, and that you're challenged, you're struggling with that, and I mean, this goes into another question I would have at some point, much more barbed question about how the open is actually constructed upon, this kind of unrecognized precarious
Same
labor.
with people in the past too,
Yeah.
right?
So the open access, we have this fetishization of openness as this master signifier
Yeah.
of our time. It comes out of software culture, but it's also at the same time, it is the language of the managerial revolution. So that's just, yeah.
Oh, and I think we didn't really get into like digital inequities in terms of access, in
Yes.
terms of bandwidth. I mean, there's a great podcast, Access for Who, that's looking at digitization of African cultural heritage and who actually benefits from that. So
Yeah.
I think we talked about precarity of input, but we didn't necessarily talk about differential access in terms of users, as well as, of course, the sort of epistemologies, a framework that we talked about with database, or data sovereignty has not come up either when we talk about things like geolocating sites. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that really struck me in terms of, access and inequities was, engaging with Gino's paper as an editor, and also, thinking about, who gets to access this material? I mean, our region primarily up until this point has been looking at culture in the Middle East, and there is no Arabic translation. And that's something that absolutely should be included. But to what extent do people in the Arabic speaking world, would they have access to this type of database? You know, how do we create something for, you know, a community on whose cultural property we are taking, you know, like.
Well, and how many Arabics are you including, right? Because
Exactly, and that the
standard
not-
Arabic is
right?
in and of itself not a
Exactly.
universal,
And
yeah.
so this was it's sort of a really reflexive chapter for us in recognizing our own problems. It's my problems as the person who created this. In how we do data collection and how we promote equity and inclusion. And yeah, recognizing that is inherently problematic, what I've created. Do you guys have anything you wanna?
Oh, endless.
Oh, then kick us off, Kristen.
Well, I think this question of access, I think it's a really important one. And I mean, we, as part of this volume, one of the contributors, Heba Abdelgawad, has a really wonderful project called Egypt's Dispersed Heritage that's looked originally, I guess, as a postdoc she was working on outlining where Egyptian heritage had been dispersed throughout UK institutions. But one of the coolest parts of this project, I think, has been both this very community-based engagement in the production process, which speaks to a lot of the challenges we've had, that we are not practicing community-based production and construction techniques, but also then incorporated a lot of public outreach through the comic series that was created. And a lot of those focus specifically on this question of access and speaking for others. So the first comic talks about Heba telling Nasser about the comic about all of the dispersed heritage. And then he starts wrapping toilet paper around himself so that he can go to travel to the places and see the cultural heritage that Egyptians as human beings do not have access to travel, and visa issues preclude their participation in even accessing their heritage. And so I think one of the biggest issues is we rely on this sort of open access as not only a kind of band-aid for a human access issue, but then I think opens really dangerous opportunities for digital restitution taking the place of actual restitution. And so I think for example, the Benin Dialogue group that the British Museum is part of, they highlight that they're going to be a part of digitizing material. And I think that is a way to, occlude this conversation about the actual physical rematriation or repatriation of this material that France, Germany, Smithsonian, everybody else has been a part of. So I think not only is it problematic in terms of its sort of epistemologies and structures, its participation, but also what it lends itself to in terms of taking the place of real, actual, anti-colonial work and democratization work. Yeah. Sorry, I could do that a long time. Oh, question.
Oh,
Yeah.
So I wanted to follow up on originally Tino's comment on engaging people on the ground that you put specifically in Greece. And I want to point out something that just came to my mind, especially as earlier on we're talking about DeepL and these phenomenal large language model translators, etc. We're facing a danger where in the past we had a colonial relationship with a local translator, where you could pay a bit of money to give you access to local knowledge production and materials, but at least you were tied to that translator, so you had an anchor on the local. We're facing a situation where the Velpion, for example, in Greece, can be fed as a PDF in a large language model and be translated. And maybe the classical stuff is not going to be translated, but any kind of narrative around it or any publication out of Greece. And then suddenly you don't even need the local. So even as we can be so happy with this idea that I can give my students whatever article I want because just throw it in DeepL and you can read it. It doesn't matter that you don't know the language. At the same time, that level of accessibility can dispense the local knowledge and the obligation that we might have to actually substantively engage with the local culture and its language and its academic production in order to have a relationship. It's not a comment on you, it's just an idea that came up just thinking about this.
I mean, that I think very much fits into what a lot of us are actually dealing with in terms of, having the need to engage with local cultures as part of, working with materials around them. You cannot do this in isolation. You shouldn't do it in isolation. And these language models sort of completely entrench us into our existing communities and sort of separate us from, having to learn a language to engage with a local community, or to engage with the material in question. So, I mean, yeah, I think it fits perfectly into what the broader conversation we've all been having is, yeah.
And I know this comes up in digital archive studies, the idea that transnational digital archives are creating opportunities to sort of pop in and out of a digital space and extract knowledge without engagement with that community. Plus, as we know, there is so much of communication that is not translated on the page. And so as soon as we sort of disarticulate the voice from the human being, we're also going to be losing all sorts of information and knowledge. So I think it's dangerous on so many levels.
I've also struggled though, because I mean, even language acquisition is also something that's a barrier to a lot of people, right? So I mean, translating things into English then, allows people who don't have you didn't grow up studying another language, whether ancient or modern, and even, our assumptions in the field of plastics about ancient language learning, right, have also, although once again, you should approach people in the original language, like ancient Greek, for example, but even that had this other kind of bent on it that you were only an elite if you could read ancient Greek and Latin, right? And so, and that precluded so many other people who didn't have the Oxford or the pre-Oxford plus then the Oxbridge education, private schools in England from actually even engaging with that world and engaging with the field of plastics, which meant our field became very white. So, and white and elite, right? And that's kind of its legacy. So there's also that aspect too, that you also even, it goes both ways, and I guess what I'm trying to say, the inequities.
Yeah, this has been fascinating, all of you. I'm really excited to check out all of your projects. Christine, I was really interested in what you had to say about the dangers of using replicas kind of as a band-aid for repatriation or as a thing for repatriation. Because a lot of the stuff, the sort of public discourse I've seen about 3D models is using them in a more pro-repatriation way. Like, one of the big arguments around the Parthenon marbles right now is like, Greece has these beautifully done replicas. Why not send those to the British Museum and bring the originals back to Athens?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's the good version of that. The problem is that they're starting to say, well, what if we scan and we send you a digital version of the scan? And what if you print it yourself there? Or what if, then there's this question of ownership, right? So you have the scan of the bust of Nefertiti, and then the Naos Museum claims ownership of that. And so that is a copyrighted thing versus some of the sort of Scan the World program that is allowing open access. But then again, you have these questions of data sovereignty. So who is making those decisions? Is it a museum halfway across the world that's saying it's fine to scan a heart scarab that represents a mortuary object that was tied to an ancestral remain that has been displaced from their homeland? So it opens up all of these, I think, really important but really valid conversations about the decision-making process. So in a perfect world, it is local communities and source communities who are saying, wonderful, we would like this returned. So the Smithsonian and the Tlingit communities had a really good, pretty sure it's the Smithsonian collaboration where they were very involved in all of those decision-making processes. So I think there are good examples for how that can work, where source communities have an active voice in reproduction, in whether or not this is something that should exist for certain objects or not, or certain holdings or not. And then decision-making about whether or not objects are returned, who they're returned to, how these sort of conversations happen. So I think ideally, like that's the great version, is that our digital technologies are opening up potential avenues for knowledge, information sharing that couples with repatriation. What I think we're seeing is not necessarily always that. And so it is leading to things like, well, we can scan these and then you have a scan of it for yourself and we own the rights to the scan that we've created, and sort of these sovereignty questions that are really challenging.
I did have a follow-up question, but if other people want to jump in, go ahead. I don't want to take all the space. No, go ahead, Nina. Great. I was wondering what do you think about the potential of 3D scans and 3D modeling as a means of preservation, like.
Yeah.
I'm thinking this is a really interesting sequel to all of those Roman copies of Greek originals, and now.
Love it. Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is also a wonderful, or opens up wonderful possibility. And I mean, I think where a lot of the general public was first introduced to 3D printing and cultural heritage was in some of the sites that have been destroyed through terrorism and choices around whether or not things were recreated. And there are some great critiques of the Palmyran Arch reconstruction and about some of the shortcuts that were taken and some of the ways that it was not serving source communities. And so I think there are wonderful opportunities for potentially for 3D reproductions to be offering avenues for both protection of and in some instances recreation of lost cultural heritage. Again, though, I think the conversation needs to be driven by source communities, and there are some great, I think, individuals who are leading that kind of movement. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking so many of the destroyed sites were continuously used in a religious context, like the Buddha statues in Afghanistan that the Taliban bombed.
Oh, the bombing Buddha. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Those were, there are still Buddhists in that area. They
Yep.
are still using those statues.
Yep. Yeah, and I think what it was, 2015 when they did the projection
Yeah.
project
Yeah.
of them. Yeah, so I think there are really, really great potentials that digital media and digital technologies are offering. And I think it just really requires us to be really, again, reflexive, and I told you kind of sense to play to Mike. This idea that we need to be really reflexive in the choices that we're making, why we're doing it, who we're serving in doing it, and whose voices need to be centered in these discussions and in these processes. So again, to plug that podcast, Access for Who, it's a wonderful sort of interrogation of all of these questions of digital reproductions, museums, cultural heritage, all of these kinds of spaces. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, Sarah.
I had a question for the religious database.
Me?
So
Yeah.
sorry.
Gino.
Like,
Oh, good. Yeah,
Name tags, not on
yeah, no worries.
There's a lot.
and I apologize.
No worries.
But I was wondering how your questions are generated on your database. Like, I guess I'm wondering, like, is there opportunity for people to ask questions that may not have already been presented? It's just thinking of reflexivity, like if the academics who are creating this database maybe aren't from the area or they're coming at it from a strictly academic perspective, is there opportunity for that different point of view to ask?
Thank you for that question. So, the questions that I showed you earlier, so each of the 3 poll types has about between 300 to 500 questions. All of those questions were, I wouldn't say generated, but we came up with them. Not me, but we got several of our team leaders to come together and figure out what questions should be asked. And a lot of that had to do not necessarily with just strict curiosity, but a lot of it had to do with the research questions of the people involved in creating those questions. I want to add that in the beginning of the project, so around 2012, I wasn't involved yet. I think I was in my master's then. The original creators of the DRH were cultural evolutionists. So a lot of their questions had to do with cultural evolution. They wanted to see broad trends from all over the world to be able to say, perhaps some of them were very environmentally deterministic questions, like climate versus supreme high gods and stuff like that. And those are the kinds of questions they had. We've moved on for the most part from those kinds of questions and are less social sciencey and more what is the
Humanistic.
humanistic? Thank you. Yeah. From my experience, so we're currently creating a religious object poll. So it's going to be our 4th type of poll. Before it comes out, we had I think it was a year and a half ago, we had a sort of we invited people to, we invited some scholars to listen to the kinds of questions that we were going to be asking, get their feedback on it, and we got some really good responses. So we got some really good critique as well on what we should change. Some of the things that we were asked. So for the religious objects, what about things that, for example, Indigenous communities wouldn't want on there? And what about things that don't exist anymore? And stuff like that. So yeah. As for the second part of your question, where it was dealing with, I think you said potential for more questions. To be asked, I don't think the DRH is set up so that the infrastructure could allow for the person answering the questions to actually ask the questions. But that is something you could perhaps answer on the comment feature. Okay, so I answered this way, but I don't actually agree with the, I'm only allowed basically 3 choices in my answer. So I'm gonna explain a little bit more. That's the closest you could get to answer. Megan's also an editor if she has.
I think it needs it in terms of just being more collaborative too. Like you can challenge people. So that's
Yeah.
another thing, right? Experts can come and look at someone else's entry and say, what about this? Or
Yeah, there's a challenge feature, actually. I forgot to mention that. It's when you're reading through each individual entry, there's a little, in each question, there's a little button that says challenge on it. If you're a scholar who doesn't agree with that, you can click challenge and maybe add your own little
I like that.
explanation.
I'm getting ideas for other
Combat channels.
And in order- and also in order to promote multivocality in scholarship, we allow multiple entries on the same topic. For example, on the Roman cult of Mithras, Roger Beck, who is a longtime, expert on Mithraism, wrote an entry near the beginning of the DRH. Matt McCarty, one of our colleagues at UBC, didn't agree with some of the things he wrote, so he wrote his own entry with different answers. So yeah, it's lots of different ways you could go about it. And the database will still support the contradictions.
Because I was also, I'm in a theory class right now, so I'm learning a lot, we're creating like Indigenous archaeology, and we're talking a lot about community oriented, community-based archaeology. So I guess it comes also to like the function of the database, like, is it scholars asking and answering scholarly questions, or is there space for communities to learn what they want to know about their own heritage? I guess that's also a follow-up with the challenge. Is there space for that kind of engagement as well as maybe outside of an academic sphere of what communities want to?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up people outside of the traditional academic sphere. In general, we recruit academics, but we don't have a problem with, for example, someone who researches, I'm trying to think of a group, Catholicism, and they're a Catholic priest. If they have an entry that they would like to contribute and they want to, them being a priest doesn't necessarily preclude them from submitting an entry. In addition to people from non-traditional academia, from people from working in the archaeological efforts in Greece, for example, they very rarely they often don't get a platform in Anglophone spaces. And so this is I think this is a good way for them to be involved in putting their research, example. And, yeah.
Evan, I think you had your hand up earlier. Yeah.
Thanks. Great, very exciting. Report of the book. I found it sort of mind-boggling myself to think about the ways that the numbers of people who interact with some of the digital humanities stuff I've done that's on, as opposed to those who are likely to interact with my more traditional scholarship, which is exciting to think about, reaching so many people. On the flip side, it seems like there are so many new digital humanities projects these days, some of which seem to duplicate what's already out there and kind of die quickly. And so I guess, in general, I'm curious, especially for the two database chapters, just in hearing your thoughts on, like, how do we think about where and when to make these kinds of interventions? And I would also be interested in hearing more concretely, like, how do people use, or how do you anticipate people using these tools? Because some of my own material from my own area appears in both of these, and at the same time, I'm wondering.
Aurora, do you want to answer that question?
In terms of like who we see using this project?
And how?
And how?
How? I know we've talked in the past about this being like a pedagogical tool as well. And so something that like students can use. But I know I almost feel like you're better suited to answer as someone who works in Marian scholarship, because most of what I do as a researcher doesn't appear on the Digital Mary database. But I know that you've encountered a lot of issues when you were doing your doctoral work with finding this information, and so trying to consolidate it for researchers.
Yeah, I mean, originally this arose out of a very naive plan to consolidate all of the material in one place because I could never find it in one place. But a lot of that had to do with, you know, barriers to access. And this is something I think those of us who work in the Mediterranean world all have encountered, is that one, it's always behind a paywall, or, you know, you have to have academic institutional access to these, or in my case, you know, a lot of the material that I actually needed for my dissertation required me to fly to Egypt to consult libraries of these, I mean, extremely colonial institutions whereby you have, I'm not going to name out names, but, you know, you have countries that have houses there. And the only place where these materials appear is in the archives of those houses. And so for me, it was extremely financially difficult as a graduate student to go to all of these different places and acquire that knowledge. And so part of the reasoning behind it was, let's just make this accessible. And I envisioned it being used by people who, you know, were working on Marian scholarship, students who are you know, studying Mary, and now two of the girls in the room here are actually my Mary class and are contributing entries to the database. And so, you know, trying to, at this point now, open up the scholarship to new people and new places, you know, trying to do this from a place of pedagogy, but also still making this a resource where anyone who's interested in Mariology can come get the information, but also now, and as they're working on, interacting with the debates around each of these objects or places in this interpretive section that we're developing. So that's sort of where our trajectory was.
What are the things that you feel are really hard to access? Images?
Images, sometimes the material only exists in travelogues, like 17th, 18th century travelogues, where the only, you know, picture, which is the hand-drawn picture of a, you know, a painting of Mary, that because preservation was not a thing back then, they don't exist anymore, right? So that's, that was sort of the major barrier for me in that way, yeah.
In the case of the DRH, although we do claim to be open access, and that it's meant to be used by everyone, I do think, I'm speaking personally right now, I do think that we are targeted more towards academics working in universities than the general public. I sometimes struggle to see how people in the general public would make use of the DRH. Aside from using the Animate tool and stuff, it's not exactly, aside from the description and the pretty little maps that we have at the beginning of our entries, it's just a lot of yes or no questions. And In my case, sometimes really long comments. So yeah, and even though the initial intent was there, sometimes I feel like we're not really succeeding in it being open access. Yes, it's open to everyone, but who's really gonna use that outside of the university? Yeah, thank you for that question, Whitney.
Okay, one last question, because I'm realizing we're coming up to 4 o'clock. So this went by really fast.
So, you know, the education question, as you were depending on the municipal area, I just started thinking, you know, the possibility for the presenting UCL kind of mass database is full of evidence of seals for people with bags on the seals, forget the text, etc. I wonder if at some point the people who exist in this world of digital projects need to have a conversation with technologists on common standards that would allow easy, quickly scrubbing and going through fellow databases for cross-referencing and use of information that we all intend to have open use, right?
Yeah.
So the intention is that, and this is a technical issue, but I'm sure that the bunch of computer scientists can sit around and start talking with us on how to do that, because the potential for cross-fertilization from existing databases will be endless there.
Yeah.
But the question is, that also requires funding to bring people to the table, to have the conversation and spend time doing the work that we did over a conference, only at a bigger scale, right?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also comes back to, you know, we all speak about open access, but we speak about open access in our own projects. And how willing are we to give up control of our data? And I think this comes back to a lot of what Mike contributed to the chapter. You know, it really does come back to, we are using these projects in many ways as a way to further academic careers, you know, to have things on our CV that are good for tenure. And do we come to a point where we truly are open access, where projects across vast spectrums are willing to give up proprietary control of the material on their project, even though if it's open access, to share across databases?
I'd also say, like, I think another thing that where there's lots of barriers too is this is a bit tangential, and I realize we're almost done, but between humanities and STEM, like we're also not really trained, and I've really struggled with that, with wanting to be a better scholar and wanting to use data in better ways, which involves developing skills in quantification and computation, and just not having the opportunities to do that. And also like bifurcating our own students into humanities and STEM, when research shows that the more integrated their education is, the better they do. And I think that's, like, to me, it's something that's been on my mind lately, because I've been trying to apply for grants to hold a conference that integrates humanities and STEM techniques, not just for research purpose, but for educational purposes. And yeah, and I think that can also, it's kind of like it's almost like the answer to saving humanities, but it's this, it is an answer to like making all of this more meaningful, what we do, and encouraging students to be in humanities for so many different reasons as well, because they do, you know, the more we can integrate these things, like, you know, building databases and quantifying and producing content, producing podcasts too, that was a learning, and videos was obviously a learning for so many people. And so much of this becomes just mass learning curves that we just kind of end up in. And I think that I'd like to make a plug also that, like, to think more broadly about integrating these things to make things not just open access, but just to make education something that's more integrative and open and beneficial.
So this goes back to kind of Evan's question, which had a number of layers. Whether it's remains as these sort of I'm going to use a bunch of entrepreneurial tech terms here, because ecosystems of disparate projects, you know, driving ahead in almost a condition of permanent innovation without stopping and having to question, you know, the consciousness of the question of why, what is going, what's the purpose. And I'm not commenting on these projects, but just a general thing. Whether or not these are open access, or disparate, separate from one another, or in a state of collaboration, in integration with one another. We're still dealing with like an automatism of technical and digitization, drive to digitization. That is, maybe that needs to be up for question and discussion. And that's a political question, if you ask me.
And I would also say, like, also, you know, in terms, people get trepidated by the DRH as well. It's like you're quantifying religion, like it's
Yeah.
it is like this hegemonic thing that, you know, the scholarly establishment is doing to something that is so personal. And so, you know, how can you take this massive database of 300,000 entries or whatever and try to say that that represents what people's actual religious experiences are and stuff. But I think the more that humanities is kind of involved in this, like the more you can integrate these
Mhm.
things, that you should be doing that. Because we deal with this, also something I'm thinking about too is it's kind of like this scientific imperialism with the rise of like DNA and all ancient DNA and kind of using that to makes these
Yeah.
really problematic statements.
Yeah.
And of course, people are like, well, this is, the point is not to push that away and ignore it, but to like integrate as more in these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And I know, I mean.
I'm just loving some, like, you know, there's some synergy here.
It is management. It's synergistic management.
We have to shake up the language a bit because, you know, we like in the university now, we've like sort of adopted this whole business, corporate, new management. You know, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's pedagogy or scholarship, you know, it's whether we call it active learning or studio learning or collaboration or instrument. And I know.
Are we gonna plug a third university as possible? Because that book is awesome.
I guess I don't know.
Have you read it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't know how to plug anything. I'm just. trying to think.
Well, on that note, we have hit our, we have a
From the
question.
chat.
We have an online.
Oh, lovely.
yay.
We're just gonna keep it kind of simple.
Okay.
They're requesting recommendations on podcasts on just general history. So what's your favorite?
People in the past.
And we have a very, we haven't really announced it. I don't know if we can say anything. Can we say something?
It's being recorded shortly.
So I got a grant from Western Washington University, a social justice and equity grant. So we have an upcoming season on cultural heritage, on the legacies of colonialism. And it is some like awesome participants and I am so excited for that. So that'll be coming.
We also have to plug our fellow participant in the book, Lives, who came here to give a talk. Let's talk about myths, baby, if you're interested in myths.
The Access for Who one, I'm a big fan of. It's only 4 episodes. The Monument Lab podcast is also great. There's an excellent episode, Museums Are Not Neutral, which is spectacular.
Yeah.
Also, the Sapiens podcast is pretty wonderful, and I'm a big fan of.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that monument one again?
Monuments Lab, and there's an episode, Museums Are Not Neutral. There's wonderful episodes, but that's a great one that speaks to a lot of this.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out today and for these really wonderful contributions to a much needed discussion around the sort of state of our field. But before we leave today, I want to let everyone know about our next presentation, which will take place Friday, March 22nd at 2:30 with Alexander Jovanovic, previously a PhD student here with the SNF Center and now an assistant professor at the University of University of the Fraser Valley. In his talk, can I please speak to the manager, state presence in the Provincial Society of Humanities?
Speaking of management.
Speaking of management, and also coming up next Thursday, March 21st, is the 8th annual McQuinney Memorial Lecture featuring fifth-year speaker Michalis Sotiropoulos, entitled Liberalism and the Foundations of the Modern Greek State. Thank you, and we hope to see you all next week.